Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Deacon Vicki Hanrahan, Assistant to the Bishop for Synodical Life, and I want to thank you for joining us today for this Equipping the Saints webinar, which by design provides updates from Bishop Rogness, but also, and equally important, it provides space for us to have conversation about timely issues on being church together. So to that end, we continue to invite pastors and lay leaders to share their expertise and their wisdom on specific topics. And today, to join in the conversation about streaming worship services, we welcome Reverend Jim Hearn, who's the pastor at Barneveld Lutheran Church in Barneveld, and Eric Holmer, who serves as the Director of Media on the staff of Good Shepherd Madison and Verona. So thank you to both of you for joining us today. Also with us to join in the conversation about living in the wake of George Floyd's death and the aftermath and implications for our life as church are Mary Nervig, who is on Synod Council and on the Synod's Racial Equity Team, and Reverend Andy Twighton, who's the chair of the Racial Equity Ministry Team and pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Madison. So thank you, both of you, for joining us today. We will open with prayer, and then Bishop Rogness will give some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Throughout the hour, feel free to write your questions in the chat area, and Bishop Rogness and our guests will address those during our conversation. And at that time, we'll unmute you so that in case you have any follow-up to the questions that you're asking. Also, just wanted to note once again that we are recording this webinar for those who are unable to make it, and those get posted to the Synod website. And of course, if you want to use it to go back and reference anything that you want to listen to, it's available as a tool for that. So let us open and get centered with prayer. Merciful God, we gather today as your followers for holy conversations about how we can make changes and take responsibility for joining in partnership with you in all that you desire in our lives. These are fearful times, Lord, and we ask that you calm these storms as only you can do. As you helped Elijah on Mount Horeb after journeying in the wilderness for 40 days, move us from a fearful, paralyzed state to a proactive movement of empowerment of ourselves and others. Bless our conversation this afternoon and throughout the day, and help us to focus on the purpose of our ministry of expanding your kingdom. We ask that you love us into being as loving as you. We ask all of this in your holy name. Amen. Bishop Rogness, I will hand it over to you. And, okay, yep, we need to unmute you here. There you go.
Thanks for setting it all up and for taking care of technology for those of us like me that are not so technologically astute. Anyway, we started these gatherings 3-4 weeks ago when the issue pressing upon us that was good to be in conversation together about was how do we come to conclusions, or how do we make decisions about how best to negotiate the church's life in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly how do we begin to respond to the decisions we're facing about when and how to reopen. So that's been what we've talked about all these times. And last week when we were together, we recognized that that we're now at the point where churches are getting onto the coming much closer to a time of deciding to regather in some form, in some perhaps limited numbers. But at the same time, I and others have encouraged continuing to do streaming worship that has been the mainstay of our worship life for the last couple months. So last week, as we talked about that, we thought it might be helpful to ask a couple people who are familiar with streaming to just give some sort of streaming for dummies tips on how do you go about doing that. The reason it's becoming more a more logical need is that if we are in fact returning to more activity on a Sunday morning, we ought not be inviting everybody to be there, and we ought not be saying that's the only option for worshiping now. So we need to continue streaming rather than record ahead of time, as many of our churches are now doing. If they're doing on something more on Sunday morning, they might as well just stream it and not have to do 2 sets of preparation. So it was real obvious that that's a topic we ought to talk some about. That was last week we decided that. Well, last week we were just at the cusp of a lot of other things happening in our world and shaking our communities and dominating the consciousness of our people, beginning with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and what has now become not only weekly demonstrations, often erupting into violence, nightly demonstrations erupting into violence, not just in the Twin Cities, but in, last count I heard was 70 some places around the country, probably more, which is such a dominant, which has moved what issues of race, which have always been with us, but may have floated to the back burner in the midst of a pandemic. It's moved it right back onto the front burner. And I think we need to begin to talk together as leaders of congregations, leaders of faith communities, to what's going on in our faith communities and what's the Lord calling on us to be doing in the midst of our leadership, in exercising our leadership roles. So I'm gonna honor what we said this week's was to be about. And as Vicki mentioned, we've got a couple of folks who have been doing streaming to talk a bit about what they do and see if some questions arise or there are other possibilities emerge for further conversation. It won't be all exhausted today, but we can at least talk a bit about that. But then I'm going to shift us from that conversation into the more timely and perhaps more pressing conversation around the George Floyd and the demonstrations and this moment in history. So that's my plan for this hour. And so let me, we invited, Vicki got in touch with Jim Hearn, who's at Barneveld Lutheran, has been streaming for some time. Eric Milton, who's the tech person at Good Shepherd in Madison. And I suspect there are others of you who also have some experience with doing that. But let me just ask Jim and Eric for starters to say if there are in this group, as I'm sure there are quite a number of people who have now in the last 2 months mastered what it is to record and post worship, but now they want to take a step to actually streaming it on Sunday morning. What's the simplest 1, 2, 3 to get to the point of doing that effectively? What would you advise folks to be doing? So who wants to, Jim, my eyes float to you first. Do you want to say
First
something?
of all, you shouldn't know the bishop or the deacon in the Synod office because you get roped into. I'm sure many of you probably can offer more than I can, and Eric, I'll defer to you as well. When I got to Barneveld a couple years ago, we had nothing. And so I began to float the idea to our council and worship team about the idea of streaming, that there is a community of people for various reasons, sports, work, other things just getting in the way, that can't get here Sunday morning, that would, would want to tune in if that possibility was given to them. And so we did a little bit of research, and we ended up purchasing a live streaming camera itself through Fearings right here in Madison. So Fearings came out, installed the camera, did tech support with us and all that. And we linked that through our Facebook page. So we were streaming our worship through our Facebook page. We've been doing that for roughly the last 2 years. And we've kept it very, very simple. You can do a lot of things, and the camera is probably outdated now. But we have one camera, and it's kind of focused on the chancel area behind me. So it catches the reader, catches myself, catches, when the kids come up, kind of all those central moments of any worship experience. Our Facebook page is an open page, so you don't need to be a friend to be able to see what's going on. You don't even need a Facebook account. So older folks that aren't comfortable using Facebook or are on Facebook, they can just Google our Facebook page, and then they can see all the videos that we stream. So I would say that's one step. Even easier than that, you can get your iPhone or iPad, and if you have Facebook, you can stream right on that. I'm guessing many of you are already doing that. But Eric, I'll defer to you if you have other steps that you would include.
Yeah, thanks very much. I love talking about how we started streaming, because similar, it was about a little over 2 years ago now, we were having a Monday, Thursday service. And actually one of our pastors said there was somebody at home that wanted to know how to watch. And it was one of our members who was over 90 years old, I believe. Audrey Converse was her name, and she wanted to watch. So the notion that it's only a certain age group that was looking for live streaming is definitely not true, at least not true anymore. And so people, for all reasons like it was said, want to be able to participate either live or any of these services. If you broadcast live, you can watch it on replay, which is really cool. It's kind of like a built-in DVR for what you're doing. So that's a helpful feature. But yeah, there's kind of, good, better, best, like anything, I guess, with the technology solution. But really, if you've got an iOS device, iPhone, Android, you can do live streaming from your church. Now, if you want, that wouldn't afford you any ability to control what people are seeing beyond just what the iPhone is seeing. If you want to introduce some control and be able to mix different elements in, I would suggest to you a piece of software that we've been using for the past 2 years, something called OBS, Open Broadcast Studio. It's a free open source piece of software. If you just look up OBS Studio, you can find the link to it, or I can share that with Vicky and she can email it out. But essentially what it is, it's a piece of software that lets you share content in your live feed from a lot of different sources. So you could show the web camera and then show some liturgy on screen. And then you could switch to showing a pre-recorded video that you have. So it really serves as a way to mix a lot of different elements into what you're showing live. And it's a really helpful tool to have that, again, is totally free. There's a bit of a learning curve, but used in its most basic way, it's quite simple. So I would recommend, if there's one takeaway, if you're looking to kind of have an additional level of control beyond just the camera and live, whatever comes out, OBS is a great way to do that. Another thing to consider is how to interface. If you're filming in your sanctuary where you probably already have a pre-existing soundboard, something to consider is how to get the really high quality audio feed from that, take it from the soundboard, I guess, into what you're using to broadcast, whether that is just a device or into your computer that's sharing it. So that's another thing to consider. And I guess, yeah, I'm not sure how deep we want to go, but yeah, to give an example of our setup, we previously had just a one camera setup at our both Madison and Verona campus, which we decided to broadcast all services from just our Verona location. So then we brought over the 2 cameras. I will say the name of the software, again, someone asked, was OBS. So it's Open Broadcaster Studio is what it's called, OBS. And it's a free piece of software for Windows or Mac. But to connect, if your church that you've been using, like say a high definition camcorder or a DSLR camera to pre-record your services, those are able to connect to a desktop or laptop computer with a piece of hardware so that you can use that high quality camera for for streaming. The only caveat being, as with many things, when the pandemic hit, there was a run on all the hardware to connect your camera to your computer. So they're oftentimes back ordered many weeks. So it may be difficult to come by. But if you did want to use, if you have a high quality camcorder that your church has that maybe you use to shoot videos or pre-record things, those can be used. And they're also an easy way sometimes to take an audio feed from your soundboard in as well, so that you're getting the audio and high quality video, then connected through something like OBS to share through Facebook and YouTube. The last piece of advice I'll have is, previously we were trying to figure out how to be on Facebook and YouTube because we had people that were in both places, and we found another piece of software. This is web-based, called Caster, and this is at castr.io, caster.io. And this allows you to record once and then send your feed to multiple places. So it could be on your Facebook page and your YouTube page at the same time. So, and there's a lot of details that probably are far too much to go into just on this chat about how to actually get that all to work, but I'm happy to pass along some links for that. And thank you, Jason, for sharing that link I see to everybody. But that's kind of been what we've used, the 2-camera setup, then split 2 ways so that on Facebook and YouTube, audiences can engage.
Good stuff. Thank you both. Other hints that others of you might have to add to the conversation, or questions of either Jim or Eric?
Bishop, I'll, as people are maybe posing questions, I sent to Vicky a little while ago. I follow Kerry Newhoff on Twitter, and he had a great article about, you know, especially for places that don't have a budget, don't have a lot of money, of things. And he was a pastor of a mega church, and now he does coaching and all that. And so he put together a great article and recommended devices under $100, and then next level, and then things that he's using, which doesn't even break the budget. But I guess that brings me to a practical piece of advice. If it wasn't part of your congregation's budget before, certainly press or encourage your council and congregation to include it now, some type of technology piece in the budget, so that you can, I mean, we're going to be doing that. We've been streaming, as Eric has at Good Shepherd there for the last 2 years. And we're going to be looking to update our equipment because streaming will be with us now. I mean, there's going to be some of our folks that will not want to return whenever that return is for all of our different congregations. So to have that piece in place, I think it's just an important piece of advice to try to include that in your budget, folks. And you know, you might, you know your individuals in your congregation, you might seek out individuals who'd be willing to make a donation just towards that as well. And think small. If you're not doing anything, it's the simplest of ways, right? It's about connecting with folks. I use my iPhone in the mornings and go live and do a little daily meditation as I walk. You know, so it could be as simple as that. We are using OBS, what Eric referenced, and we interface that with Facebook. There's some pros and cons to that. Sometimes you'll get back echoes, but you can pre-record things. Musicians, people can record things from their own homes, readings, music pieces, sermon pieces. You can drop in videos. So there's some great advantages to that, but start simple, what you're comfortable with, and then grow from there.
Great points. Thanks, Jim. We have some other questions in the chat area. One of them is, what is the hardware to connect a camera to the laptop? Maybe that's a question for Eric.
Yeah, I think I responded privately, but basically you'll need something that most cameras, and there's 2 primary connections you connect a camera. One being HDMI, which is pretty ubiquitous in consumer cameras. Then if you have a higher professional camera, it might have something called a SDI link. And so depending on your camera, more than likely it's got HDMI out, and you need something on your desktop or laptop to receive that HDMI signal. And if it's a laptop, it's going to be something that you convert to USB. We used a device called Elgato Camlink. They also have a couple other ones. They're very popular, actually. People that stream their video gaming, that's kind of where they got popular from. So that the company, if you go there, like, this looks like a gaming site, that's what it is. But that can be had for anywhere from $150 to $250. And then if you're using a desktop computer, there's a company called Blackmagic, which makes capture cards, they're called, and that requires a little bit more work, and you have to open up the PC and install it into a slot. But those are a bit more reliable, I would say, in my experience, than some of the USB-based products. And those, again, range anywhere from $150 to $300. And those are, the product that we use is called the DeckLink capture, but they have a whole range of products. But yeah, working also with an AV integrator, I think one was mentioned, but somebody that as a provider, they might have access to different parts that aren't available in stores right now. Like I mentioned, there's quite a bit of back order on a lot of these technologies that allow you to connect the computer to PC, as everybody's trying to do the same thing right now in terms of streaming as high quality as possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we're at our half hour. That went by quickly.
It did.
I want to thank Jim and Eric for being on for that part of the conversation. And there are a lot of comments in the chat room, so if you're paying attention, there's some answers in there as well on licensing and so forth. So do pay attention to the chat room.
And we can certainly in coming weeks return to this, or you now have a sense of not only Eric and Jim, but of each other and some of the comments in the chat room. So there's at least a launch here into some of this information to help get started. But I did tell Vicki that I wanted to switch gears by 2:30 or so. So let me tee up this part of the conversation this way. I said at the opening that I thought what this past week has done is take issues. When I arrived, it was not uncommon for us to be asking questions about the role of race in our society and in our church. In 2018, an African-American woman was elected bishop and resigned a year later, which raised all kinds of questions that have had some conversation in many of our circles. And I've talked with many of you, especially in conference gatherings last fall, about that. And several years ago, this synod launched a racial equity team that has done some good work in a number of places. I'm sure many of you have been part of that. But that in the rush of two things, our synod's focus on the process leading to the election of a new bishop, and now the pandemic, issues around race sort of floated to the back burner, I think, in the consciousness of many people. I don't think they're in the back burner for much of anybody anymore these days. And we can take off in all kinds. You've been talking to all kinds of people about who you've seen or what you've seen on the news, what's been happening locally. I want to focus this conversation around who we are and how we respond as leaders of the church, being pastors, that is shepherds of a particular faith community in most of your settings. So we need to have a conversation about what does it mean at this time? For us to be shepherding a faith community? What is our role? What do we make of it? How do we help people begin to interpret or to go interpret what's going on and to begin going deeper with some of those issues? You've heard from many people, the demonstrators are saying the same things that demonstrators said in the riots in the 60s and in disturbances that pop up every so often ever since. It's time to quit talking about it. We need real change, and real change doesn't, and then particularly the death of African Americans in the hands of the police keep happening and keep reminding us that there are inequities shot through our society, and it all begins with how we have inherited a system that was based on the dominance of the white culture that came to this country 400 or 500 years ago, has dominated since, and those systems of domination and privilege are infectious, consciously and unconsciously. So to begin to dismantle that and try and build a just society is a complex and deeply troubling piece of work. But it's a piece of work we need to be at, seems to me. So I'd like to suggest that we prime the pump for this conversation with 3 people to start with. Vicki mentioned the 2 co-chairs of our racial equity team were invited to be present on this call and alerted we were going to launch into this conversation. And Gus Barnes, who's a African-American pastor on our Synod roster. Gus and I go back to years ago, life in Milwaukee, where our paths first crossed. He's now serving in the Platteville area. I'd like to hear the 3 of them just begin this conversation with what they've been thinking about as leaders in this part of the church these days. So, and I don't care which order, Andy, Mary, Gus, whoever would like to jump in. I think this group would benefit from having you launch our conversation. Such modest Lutherans that are letting someone else go first.
Well, I'm going to suggest that Andy, who is the convener of our task force, talk about. We had a meeting last night of the Racial Equity Task Force, so this actually is really germane, and we talked about exactly that. So I think Andy can talk a little bit about what we talked about.
Sure, I can go briefly here, and I know that on the call here today too, we have a few other members of the racial equity team. We saw that Walter Byris is on the call and Eric Kartenberger is on the call, so I know we have a few other members of the team on as well. But yeah, we met yesterday just to for our regular meeting, but also just to share in the grief and pain of the past. I feel like we spent the first good chunk of our meeting just checking in with one another. It's, you know, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And there are a lot of good lists out there, and I know Mary has compiled some wonderful resources that I think we're planning to make available soon in some way to you all. But so I mean, there are a lot of good lists of things you can do that are out there. You know, pray, protest, show up, donate to local organizations, listen, advocate, vote. There's a lot of things that you can do. We were thinking more particularly last night about our role as the Synod's racial equity team. We know we can and must do a lot more. But so we kind of came up with 4 main things that we thought we could encourage congregations and pastors to undertake at this time. First of all, speak out against racism in worship, in your gatherings. And there are several, I mean, you can do that at any time, but there are some opportunities coming up shortly that are very appropriate. First of all, at least in Madison, there's been kind of an ecumenical letter floating around suggesting to pastors to dedicate June 14th as a day in a unified way to speak out against racism. And that kind of dovetails nicely with the commemoration the ELCA voted on at the last assembly for the Emmanuel 9 on June 17th. So I'm going to put in the chat for everyone a link to those worship resources. There are some good resources on the ELCA website for commemorating the Emmanuel 9 on June 17th or on a Sunday near that. And if June 14th is going to be kind of a dedicated day in our area, maybe that would make sense. Or you could get together with a couple congregations on the 17th and do a service together, if online, virtually. Second of all, the racial equity team, even before this, was kind of discerning that part of our role might be to build connections and foster collaboration between congregations. And so something we're going to be working on this summer, we thought this would be a good project to do while we can only meet virtually, is to build up an anti-racist network in our synod by by asking congregations to identify racial equity liaison to stay in communication with our team and to help us stay connected to what you're doing in your congregation. We know a lot of congregations in our synod are doing book studies, they're taking action, they're having speakers, and our team would like to do a better job of helping to promote those congregational events so that people in the vicinity of you can participate together. So I'll also put a link there in the second in the chat in a second for you to learn more about that. Third of all, we talked about, particularly for those of us who are white, to do our white homework. I've heard it called. You know, oftentimes the emotional labor and kind of the burden of the racial justice conversation falls upon people of color. And so for real change to happen, we kind of have to take ownership of our anti-racist education. And so we're working on compiling a list of some good homework for those of us who are white to educate ourselves on racial inequity and racial injustice. And there are many resources online about that too. If you just go on Facebook, go on Google, you can find lists of books, but we'll try and put together a list to share. And then the fourth thing that we talked about at our meeting yesterday was to listen to and amplify local Black voices, persons of color. And there are several in our area. I mean, perhaps the best thing those of us who are white can do is to listen and to follow through with action and response. Just to name a couple off the top of my head here, we're also planning to put together a list of this too, but you know, Nehemiah or Justified Anger, Dr. Alex G is a Madison pastor who has an excellent podcast called Black Like Me. The African American Council of Churches last night had a prayer vigil that was made the news. So there are a lot of good local voices to listen to and amplify and respond to. And I think I will stop there to let Gus or Mary speak.
Thanks, Andy. Why don't we invite Gus into the conversation, especially well teed up since you just talked about the importance of listening to the voices of persons of color. Gus, talk about what's been in your mind lately.
Okay, can you hear me? Shake your head. All right. Well, here's the thing. Let me just say first and foremost, I'm not speaking on the Black community. I am speaking for Gus Barnes Jr. Gus Barnes Jr. only, who happens to be an African American. Someone asked me today how I'm doing, and I said, you know, whenever you go to a trip, and unfortunately you have to fly into O'Hare, you're in a holding pattern. And that's where my feelings and my emotions are, in a holding pattern, because I'm not sure which directions should my emotions or my feelings go. I know I'm hurt. I'm not angry, but I'm hurt. Because of the hurt, I seem to always, as African Americans normally do in situations like this, we are so willing to forgive what has happened to us. And so I forgive those cops already, despite if they go to jail or not. I have to move on. There are two things, friends, that I know that are for certain in my life. I'm going to always be Black, and I'm always going to be a taxpayer. Nobody can change those two things. Actually, three things. And I will always be a Lutheran. So those are three things that people can't take away from me. So I'm in a holding pattern. And so this morning I was talking to my spouse, and someone on Facebook wanted to organize a protest march in Platteville. Oh my God, we're 11,000 people. 6,000 of them have went home from school. So who are we going to protest with? And I serve a small congregation in Cuba City where there aren't any Black people. But here's the gift that I believe that I have, and the reason why I like serving rural churches, because they get an opportunity to see a Black person up close, personal, face to face. They don't see me in the news. They don't see me in the newspaper. They get to learn who Gus Barnes is. And they find out in a matter of time that we have so much more in common. And so we had our first service on Sunday with all the restrictions, and everyone kept coming up to me and saying, we have been worried about you, or I have been worried about them, you know? And so as a 59-year-old, I remember in the 60s, my grandmother lived in the projects in Peoria when the race riots were going on. I was too young to know any different. And so when the dogs were chasing us from the National Guard, I thought it was a game. We were running for our lives. There was burning of buildings and structures in Peoria. And so I seem like I'm feeling in that holding pattern that history has just repeated itself once again. And what are we going to do? And I'm at the point where I'm almost tired of watching the news, because they say that there's a curfew in Madison at 9:30, and when I get up at 2 o'clock, there are still predominantly white people protesting in Madison. Go home. The man has died. Your protesting will not bring him back. And so what can we as the church do? There are things, many things that we can do, but don't advocate for me. Walk with me. Help me find a solution that we can work on together, hand in hand. We can have all the meetings until Jesus comes back, and we'll still be at square root one. But we have an opportunity here as the church to make a change. And it's not going to help us walking all down, whatever that road is, Washington Street, in our collars. That's not going to save anybody. But we have to get together and come up with a plan and present that plan and say, here we are. This is what we're going to do. And until that happens, we're going to always be separate. And I still find it when we say the word people of color, well, white is a color. So aren't we all people of color? Aren't we all?
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Gus. Mary, you passed the buck pretty fast. Why don't you, what might you have to add?
Well, I'm supporting all of what you have said. And I think I'm really grateful for this moment to talk to this large group, for us to be a part of that, because I do, as we had talked earlier, after the last election and the resignation, we know that that was complicated, and we know that there were many issues involved. But one of the issues that we never talked about was the impact at some level that racism had, because our whole society is based, as you opened up with, Peter, that how we formed our country was based on, first of all, genocide, getting rid of the native population through conflicts, through war, or through disease that was brought, and slavery was instituted at the very beginning. Our whole economy was based on slavery, which was based on an assumption that people of African origin were inferior and may perhaps even seemed subhuman to the Europeans who came. So unpacking that history, and that becomes, we are so into the soup of that we don't even recognize it. So I hear sometimes people say, I have no idea how we got to this in this country. And I think, well, we got to this place because we've always been in this place. That perhaps what this moment might do is open our eyes to the possibility of seeing what is real, what the reality is, that those of us, I guess those of us who are white, have been able to live without even ever recognizing that we have been built on a system of huge disparity. So I think, while feeling really depressed and sad, and I suppose some anger, but our hopelessness, but also feel some hope that perhaps there is a groundswell once again. I guess in terms of the reality, I don't expect miracles, but maybe I do. Maybe there is a hope that somehow there could be enough of us, and especially if we're called to be ambassadors for Christ, to live as Jesus led us to live. If we believe the gospel, we don't have an option but to figure out how do we redirect our church body. How do we talk to people in our pews in a way that engages us to say that we are more alike than different? I hear what you were saying, Gus, that we are all people of color. We are all so much more alike. But at the very beginning, we were brought to be separate when people who were in charge back in Virginia, way back in the 1600s, said that indentured servants, because they were worried that indentured servants and the African slaves might come together, plus the native people, the indigenous people might come together and they might be in trouble. So they decided that the white indentured people could be free after 7 years and the African people could never be free. So, I don't know, based on an assumption that somehow white skin was superior in separating the real core issues. And so many people, white people also are suffering, we know, economically. And the issues that could unite us, and that I think many, and what we talk about in our task force is so many of the issues that rural people who feel disenfranchised, who feel not listened to, who feel marginalized, are exactly the same as the issues of what we call people of color. So if we can find places to unify ourselves where we speak the same language, we can come together and be a force for positive change and raising all of humanity and trying to create a people of God's people. That's a lot of words that I feel passionate about.
Thank you. Couple of comments. I noticed in the chat someone was asking Andy about the kind of resources that he said. I've seen the list that I was sent the list earlier. I think of a whole list of suggestions that the racial equity team has put out there. I think that needs wider circulation, so we'll get that out there. I also want to pick up on one thing that when Gus talked about starting by simply listening and listening to each other, I think one of the keys to effective leadership in a local congregation, and when I use that phrase, I look at I don't look at speaker view, I like to look at the whole collage of you who are listening to this. And it brings to mind how widely varied the parishes and the communities are where you serve. And I think we begin to bring to the fore issues of race, not by finding the right resource and then teaching what the right solutions are. We need to start by listening to where people are at, because people have attitudes, some of which may well be aligned with ours, some of which we think are very enlightened, and others of which we think, boy, do they need to get fixed. But until anybody feels that they're being listened to, they aren't going to be very open to hearing anything else. At the end of last week, I sent out that statement that the bishops in the Conference of Bishops had put together, and the first response I got to it was from a woman that I think we would say, boy, does she have a long ways to come. But she recounted, the gist of what she said, it sounds like you don't understand that racism works two ways, which I would take issue with, but she went on to recount her own personal experience of having years ago been a inner city teacher and attacked by an African-American young student, who then got off and continued to taunt her. Well, that was deeply wounding, obviously, for her. And she isn't going to move to any other place of understanding unless first someone understands that hurt, that had to have hurt. And then begin to talk about what might go deeper than that. So we listen to people's stories and we share stories. And as Andy made reference to, at some point, the more we can begin to be listening to the African American stories of what is it, we know what it's like to live white in America. Not very many of us have heard a lot of stories about what it's like to live as a person of color in America. I think we can begin by listening and launching a sharing of stories and then prodding people into deeper understanding. I'd like to, in the time we have left, I'd like to hear from some of the rest of you what you think have been some of the most promising things you've seen in congregations where you've served that have been helpful in bringing issues of racial disparities and injustice and systemic, institutional race patterns that we're part of. What have you done in local congregations that you would say that was helpful and others should learn from what we have experienced? What are some of you doing or have you done that would be good for others to hear about?
And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Say something here quick. I'm down in Spring Green, but both at my previous congregation in Cross Plains and in Spring Green, we've done, which are especially out in Spring Green, is very rural. We don't have any African American people in our community, except for When American Players Theater, which is not doing it this year, when our actors come into town. However, the main way people have been able to talk about race is through book studies, reading books that have been put out, and a couple of them, The Trouble I've Seen and Just Mercy, have been really good ways to advocate conversation within the community, not only at church, but then when people gather, like the local post garden night for music, or different places where there are gatherings, people are talking about those types of things. So book studies have been a really good way for us.
Helpful. Thanks, Kirsten.
This is David. I've been talking with Gus. Gus knows this because we're close by, but some of the history here, oddly enough, the Sunday I wanted to preach on it, we had a cancellation, but the African American community that was here arriving during the Civil War and was set free by their owner, and then were here outside of Lancaster and part of the community until the mid-1970s. The Green family, remember that, Gus?
Yep.
And you think you may even have some ties to it, but I was thinking about resurrecting that piece of history as a template to something from our history to grab onto and talk about race.
Can I just respond to that, David? With I know that the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. has a wonderful display about rural populations of African Americans. And I can't recall the author of the book. It's on my bookshelf, but I don't have the author. But Sinew and Bone talks about rural populations throughout the Midwest of African Americans. So yeah, good stuff to dig into.
So yeah, there's a cemetery here going south of town. It's still there. It's maintained, and the Grant County Museum has effects of the Green family. So parts of household things and a Civil War uniform. And what I really found fascinating was a New Testament John in Greek. I was really struck by that.
Mm-hmm.
We're really fortunate at St. Mark's to have a Seventh-day Adventist congregation meet in our building on Saturdays and rent from us. And they're African American. So I've been there at St. Mark's for about a year, and just before the pandemic started, we had set up a lunch date between our congregation and their congregation, which we will return to when we're allowed to. But meanwhile, I've asked if there's some way for them to engage with us in some kind of video pen pal type experience so that we can just tell each other stories and get to know each other better. I know that we're somewhat unique as a congregation. Most people don't have other congregations renting or worshiping in the building, but it's an opportunity for us to actually hear each other's stories.
Well, we're soon running out of time. We will post that the piece that I made reference to, and I in these future calls that we do weekly on Tuesdays at 2. I'd like to. I mean, we don't come with as you can see, a heavily programmed agenda. It began because we were all dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and decisions around coming back together and so on, sharing stories. Many of you found that very valuable in your own conference gatherings and so on. And this is that same sort of a time to simply talk together, be church together. But our culture has been shaken. Our country has been shaken. And that shaking won't go away anytime soon. So I suspect we will find ways to, in this forum as well, on Tuesday afternoons, return to this conversation. And because I hope that it's my hope that that in amidst everything else we're dealing with, and part of what I'm aware folks are dealing with now, you who are giving leadership in local congregations, is just plain weariness of having to make so many decisions and change ministry patterns and figure out how to do this and how to do everything. I know how wearying this has been, and to simply place more things on an already full and overflowing plate, on the one hand, sounds like no favor. On the other hand, these matters are on our plate. You can't turn on TV or have conversations with anybody, Zoom or in person or however, without recognizing that what's going on in the country is now in people's minds. And I forget the originator of the quote, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." This is a moment of crisis in the country, and it also becomes opportunity. Kairos moment comes around in all kinds of ways, and now to have this thrust upon us does open the door to say, how can we help something redemptive be born out of this moment in our country's histories and in our church's history? So I suspect, because that is upon us now, that we will in future weeks talk about that as well as our church life and returning to church. Vicki, you wanted to close this out. I follow instructions very well, and one of them was, when we're done, Peter, turn it back to me before we close off. So thanks again, Vicki, for setting it up.
Yep, I'll turn it back to you for one final comment, but thanks for the segue into what I wanted to share before we lose this group. To his point, we have invited Jennifer Prins, our regional representative from Portico Benefit Services, to, and as you know, they're the ELCA ministry that strives to keep us physically, emotionally, and financially healthy. So she is going to lead a webinar entitled "What to Pack When You're Not Going Anywhere." Dealing with this change can be exhausting mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Jennifer will share creative ideas on how to take care of yourself, how to take care of your people in this unusual time. She'll also share important updates about benefits and resources that can help you in the era of COVID-19. That webinar will be held on Wednesday, June 17th at 2:00 p.m. So mark your calendar for that. It's taking care of yourself so you can take care of each other. And again, June 17th at 2:00, and I'll post that in What Matters, and we'll put it up on the website as well. Bishop, any final thoughts or goodbyes?
There are, right as we conclude, a rush in the chat. So when this is recorded, Vicki, is our chat comments also a part of what's still available?
Yes.
So it might be a good idea to go back and look at a number of those things, resources and other comments and so on that are being raised. And as I said, these things just keep unfolding. So I'd like to close us with prayer. The Lord be with you all.
And also with you.
Gracious God, we don't choose the times in which we live. The times come to us, and we are infused with your Spirit to be your people of God, living in the times that come. We ask for insight and a sense of hope, courage to go into areas where we might be vulnerable. We ask for wisdom to listen well to our people and to lead to humane, compassionate, just, and peaceful places in our own communities and in our nation as a whole. Use us, Lord, as channels of your presence, channels of your grace and hope in a society that is now uncertain and wounded. We pray that you have put in each one of us gifts of leadership. We thank you for those, and we ask you to give us a sense of how they can now be best used. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for what all you do in all of your places. Thank you for your partnership.
Thanks for attending today, this Equipping the Saints webinar. It's always better with you here. Go in peace.
Thanks.